Catherine Addison's The Goblin Emperor is very different than most other things being published as fantasy right now. Even its title is a mislead. He is not Emperor of the Goblins. Our main character is called the Goblin Emperor as a slur. It is something his detractors call him, not the way he thinks of himself. This is famously called a fantasy of manners. I will get back to that. We are in a fantasy kingdom that is recognizably unlike our own, where though mostly what's how this is different from the rest of our world is what is called Ruritanian fantasy. Okay, we're just in an imaginary country where things don't work quite by our laws, but okay, it's just a highly fictional world. There is a little magic here, right? There are people who are elves and goblins. Everyone's in this novel is an elf and goblin, but these are really just people. They have prehensile ears. That's it. That's really it. These are people with long, pointy ears that move in their moods. That's what you get. There are people who can do magic. Not much magic is actually done, but when it's done, it really matters. It's not really about magic. It's not really about magic. We're at a kind of steampunk level of technology. They can do their various things with gears. They have airships. There's lots of speculative fiction has airships because when science fiction and genre fantasy became kind of self-aware genres, it was the 30s and airships were still the future. Now they're a sign of a kind of alternative past. Airships show up a lot in in novels like this as a sign of alterity, of an alternative technological pathway. And airships turn out to be tricky in this novel too. Um, I was going to make a Hindenburg joke, but maybe too soon. Most of what you expect from a fantasy novel doesn't happen in this novel. There is no fight for power. Our main character will mostly get all the power he wants and kind of more right in the first chapter. Spoilers. There is a mystery plot, but our detective hero is very much on the margins. It mostly happens off stage somewhere else. We are we are in the perspective of the person who has to kind of manage and occasionally get reports from the detective, not the detective himself. You could structure this as a mystery. They didn't. You could structure this as a rise, a struggle for power. It is not. Is there a love plot? You tell me. We can argue about it, right? But there's certainly not a standard love plot. If whatever love plot you were expecting is not really what we get here. Instead, we get a highly cerebral, very sensitive young person and thrust into ruling the massive empire of all the elf lands, and having to do this in a way that where he has a bunch of plot challenges. The main moral challenge is not to let power corrupt him. He can become the great challenge our lead character faces is keeping himself from becoming monstrous from power. Our last unit was set in an imaginary empire where that was fundamentally monstrous. Here's an empire where someone has been thrust mostly unprepared onto the throne and is trying to, not get bested by his courtiers, not get kind of deposed, but also mostly trying not to be a monster. Catherine Addison is the other writing name is the pen name of Sarah Manette, who also writes and publishes under that name, who has a PhD in English literature from the University of Wisconsin in Renaissance literature. In Renaissance drama. She did a thesis on revenge tragedy in 2004, not long ago. She was an undergraduate in Cleveland's own Case Western University, where she studied English and French and classics. A few quick things here. She has put together an imaginary empire with its imaginary rules that is deeply informed by her knowledge of early modern England, of ancient Rome. Um, there seem to be some kind of East Asian, Chinese, and Japanese elements, especially in kind of hair and dress, but is not does not map directly onto any of them. She has put together an imaginary empire, an imaginary set of customs out of things that have all happened in the real world, though never quite in this combination. She has chosen she has chosen to make her past officially sexist and homophobic, though she is not those things. Um, Fantasy writers have a choice. If they don't want to simply unwittingly or gleefully replicate the iniquities of our historical past, they can either imagine a fantasy world where those things aren't true, where women can have power, where it's not racial in any way, or they can try, and there are reasons to do that. That's what Jemison does at least some of the time. Or they can try to cop to the fact that the past was difficult and talk about the challenges there. Maya, aka Emperor Edrahasavar the Seventh, works in a system where women are given very little power to their great discontent, where where being gay is still a shameful secret, and that matters in the plot too. And he is not himself particularly sexist or misogynist or homophobic, but he is trying to work this out. Something that Monette tries to do, and that initially I think she's not going to do. The beginning of this book, you see people using the second person singular, the thou, the informal singular thou. I know if you think of thou as formal, I used to think so too, but that's actually not true. It was when it existed commonly in our language, it was the informal pronoun, the one you used for your mom, the one you used for the people you're in love with, the one you used for, it's the familiar used for your family. She's taking the royal we. She moves away from that. The thou only comes up a little. She sells the reader very quickly on the idea that all singular nouns are familiar, including I, and that plural nouns are formal. It's not just the royal we, everybody uses the we. And this gets picked up very, very quickly. It is far less distracting than attempting to replicate the thou and the proper conjugation of verbs taking thou throughout the novel. Thou is dropped in as a kind of spice or to let you know what's happening. This is a novel of manners. It's a highly formal culture. um, when some people from outside the culture finally show up late in the novel, it's a kind of breath of fresh air. I won't spoil that for you. Um, we are, we are, and I will talk about this more in the future. We are in a third person limited point of view. It is the third person. Not Maya, aka Edrahasavar, is not narrating this, but the narrator has access to his thoughts, including the fact the narrator calls him by his personal name, not his official public name, calls him by the name he uses to think about himself rather than his official imperial name, and doesn't know anything that Maya doesn't know. If Maya doesn't know it, the narrator doesn't either. Though the third person allows the narrative a little room to comment on Maya, to step apart from him and to speak for him and about. Sometimes you speak for him, sometimes you speak about him, you speak on his behalf, but you're not speaking through him per se. Now, Manderson seem very uptight, and fantasy worlds that have highly formal manners tend to be invented on balance more by Americans, which are much less mannered culture than by, say, the Brits, who don't have any fantasies about having a highly mannered, etiquette driven culture would be like. They don't have any fantasies about how everything would be different and interesting and cool if everybody were more formal. That's not that's not a fantasy for them. I want you to take, rather than just kind of dismiss the manners in this novel and a kind of I'm an American individualist, let it all hang out. I need, as long as I have shoes and shirt, I should get service kind of attitude. Let me point out two things manners do. The manners here work operate in this novel as an expression of real power relations, and that is not a good thing about them. It's a descriptive thing. The manners are there to kind of deal with society, to kind of lubricate society. Well, it is also fundamentally an expression of morals. Maya knows how to be polite. He's struggling to figure out how to be moral, and manners are a tool to do that. How do you speak to somebody compassionately? How do you move from the, not simply from the like superficial manners is I said everything in a polite way. I used a superficially civil tone. I used the correct fork for this serving, to the manners where you're actually thinking about the other person's needs and using manners to treat other people well. That is part of Maya's mission, both as a person and as a politician.